Good afternoon, everyone, in Science and Values. The purpose of this video is to talk about the paper that you have for this class. There is one final paper in the class. It has to be 5 to 7 pages in length. I will be providing you with some documents on Canvas regarding some more specific instructions as well as a sample student paper, talking in particular about the use of the first person in the paper. But I'm going to give you a more specific instructions about the mechanics that apply to any philosophy paper in the future. What I want to do here is talk about the kinds of things that you should be thinking about writing about for the final paper. On the syllabus, what I have is that you will need to choose one science and values related topic from the course and construct an argument about the topic using a contemporary example. Now, that is admittedly a little bit vague. And that's why here I want to just say a little bit more about the kinds of things you could write a philosophy paper about as it relates to this course. And let me just say one other thing. On the syllabus, it says that the paper is due Monday, August 3rd at midnight. I have to revise when that is due. I have to submit your grades for this class by Wednesday, August 5th by 9 a.m. Therefore, I cannot reasonably expect to get all 20 of your papers graded on Tuesday, August 4th. Therefore, your paper has to be due by noon on Monday, August 3rd. This is an oversight on my part. They don't give us a lot of turnaround time to submit grades during summer courses, so I need to make sure I give myself enough time to get those graded. So Monday, August 3rd at noon is when your paper is due. Now, that said, let me just say something about a philosophy paper in general. The point of a philosophy paper is to make an argument, to make a claim, and to defend that claim throughout your paper. So at the beginning of a philosophy paper, you announce that I will argue X. That is essentially your thesis statement. And what I'm asking you to do is to come up with some kind of topic related to some kind of contemporary example. And in particular, it would make sense to you're going to need to use the course readings and apply them to your example. The easiest reading to do this with is the Heather Douglas reading. What you would need to do in that case would be to choose an example of a scientist or a researcher who has communicated with the public in potentially a problematic way or an unproblematic way, but to choose a specific contemporary example of when a scientist has communicated with the public in a public forum, and then you need to evaluate whether or not that scientist's communication was morally appropriate. And this is where you can use Douglas's distinctions and apply them to the example. So you can, for example, apply the distinction between causal and moral responsibility to the example that you choose. You can also apply the distinction of reckless and negligence to the example that you choose. And then you would apply the distinction of role and general responsibility to the example that you choose. So when I teach this class in person, this is one of the papers that students most often choose, is that Heather Douglas's framework for moral responsibility is pretty straightforward. She's arguing that scientists can be held morally responsible when they make claims and communicate with the public, and we can use these different sets of distinctions and apply them to the example that you choose. You don't have to do that paper, but for example, I just finished teaching another science and values course, a shorter one. And in that course, I had students watch the movie Concussion. and you may or may not have seen this film, and it's a film that has Will Smith in it, and it's a fairly recent film, and it's about um, a a a doctor. His name was based on a true story. His name was Dr. Bennett Omalu, who discovered the link between uh, you know head trauma in football and concussions, and potentially dying from the repeated um, you know head repeated impact to the head from all of the hits in football. And so I asked students to think about that example and to apply Douglas's framework to. Um, so I, regarding that film, I asked them to examine the film, to look at Omalu as he presented his findings, um, and to use Heather Douglas's framework to make sense of whether they thought, was Omalu reckless or negligent? Did he act morally responsible when he presented his findings to the public? And so, um, in particular, this example worked because it was a very controversial example, because there were a lot of stakeholders involved. And so, choosing an example. So if you're thinking about doing the Douglas idea that I'm discussing right now, choosing an example where the research is controversial, but the research needs to be made available to the public, so that they can be made aware. But yet, maybe they don't have quite enough evidence to um, to make their claim. But they feel so. This gets into those three different ways from the Eliot chapter. But anyways, this is one idea. Choose an example and apply Heather Douglas's framework for moral responsibility from her essay to the example you choose. There are no shortage of examples right now regarding things like the coronavirus. You could look at the way that different members of the scientific community have communicated with the public. I had you read the essay or the testimony from Dr. I think his name was Rick Bright, who testified before Congress. You had to read that last week. You could use Heather Douglas's analysis to evaluate his actions when he decided to, get in front of Congress. And essentially, he was acting like a whistleblower to say that he was trying to, get information out there to the public so that they knew what was going on. You could choose that example. That could be the easiest route to take. You could also choose to use some of the readings from this week. What you could do is you could also choose an example and ask whether, for example, you could, for example, choose. In this week, we're getting into whether or not it's appropriate to lower standards of evidence. If public health is at stake, and obviously we're living through a pandemic right now, and so there's lots of, the stuff you have to read for this week. There's lots of discussions of lowering potentially normal protocols, lowering standards of evidence, because the public health crisis that we're in demands that we move faster than we otherwise would. And the question there is, what's the morally appropriate thing to do? There are going to be trade-offs. There are going to be potential benefits to, lowering the standards. Maybe we'll get a vaccine or a better test faster, but we also potentially end up with things like false positives and false negatives, and it just confuses the public more. And so you could choose the Eliot readings for this week, and using his arguments about raising and lowering standards of evidence as it relates to coronavirus vaccines and coronavirus tests. You could write a paper about that. And at the end of the day, what you're going to be doing is you are going to be making an argument. You will be evaluating the example you choose in terms of some moral framework from the readings. You will say something like, in the following paper, I will argue that Dr. Anthony Fauci was morally irresponsible in communicating in the way that he did about the coronavirus to the public. And I will make this argument using Heather Douglas's framework. And here are the reasons I think he was morally inappropriate. Whatever example you choose. But you are the one making the argument. You are the one making the claim. A philosophy paper must be making an argument. You cannot simply, present information to me. You have to pick an example and formulate an argument. The good news is that you're not necessarily having to come up with something from scratch. Use the course readings to help you figure out how you want to make your argument. So choose one of the Eliot readings. Just off the top of my head, another idea could be you could choose an example. You could use the 3 different approaches. You could use the clean hands approach, the modified clean hands approach, and the advocacy approach. You could take those 3 and apply them to your example, and you could argue which of the 3 do you think is the best way to communicate in the particular example that you choose. But it needs to be a real example. It needs to be an example that was not in the readings. If you want to email me and talk about this, we can. But I hope that this gives you some sense of how to do the paper. Again, first of all, figure out which reading you want to use, then figure out your example, and then figure out what argument you want to make. I will have some documents in the coming days that I will upload to Canvas that are going to give you some more specific information about how I'm grading you and what a philosophy paper looks like. I hope that this is helpful. And again, if you have questions, if you want to do a Zoom meeting to talk about your paper topic, you can, but you really need to start thinking about it. This course we're already in the 4th week of this course. There are only 2 weeks after this week left. And then the paper's due Monday, August 3rd at noon. Let me know if you have any questions.